Hi, everybody. I would like to introduce, thank you for coming here tonight to this month's Luke's Legacy Family Research Rounds. We are so happy to have you, and marks the last event of 2022. I was almost going to say 2023. Apparently, I am ahead of myself as things go. The reason why we have this monthly event is it is a part of the knowledge mobilization program within the Family Engagement and Research course. And if you have not heard about that, it's an opportunity for researchers as well as family members to come together and work as partners, not just as subjects in research as we are so often. You can ask me about it as well too. I'm going to put my email in the chat if you would like more information on that, and I'm more than happy to chat and have a nice Zoom coffee and talk about this at a greater length. For a bit of an introduction, my name is Ray Martins. I am your host for this evening. I work as a knowledge broker with the training program for the Family Engagement and Research course. And with me, as always, is Dr. King-Opozniak, and the two of us coordinate this program together, and we try to bring it monthly events of various themes. And tonight we have the absolute pleasure of having Tracy Moisan and Maude, and I'm going to murder your name, and I apologize. That is just not, I am travel weary, and this is just, I'm kind of not at my peak function here today, so I apologize. I just hopped a plane very early this morning all the way to Ottawa, which has kind of left me a little tired. Anyways, to move on to the next point here, we just wanted to take an opportunity to share a land acknowledgement. And as things go, it is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us all to reside on this land, and to seek to understand our place within that history. We are continually learning as to how we can do better. So today, I acknowledge the privilege that I have to live, work, and play on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta. And we, of course, represent more than one region of Turtle Island. McMaster University stands on the traditional territories of the Mississauga, as well as the Haudenosaunee Nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude. Colonialism is a present and ongoing process that requires our mindful awareness and desire to change. And with that, I am going to pass the mic off to Tracy and Maude as well too.
Thanks, Ray. I'm going to start to share my screen. Is everyone seeing that? Okay, perfect. So my name is Tracy Moisan. I am the program director for the National Consortium on AFCCA. We're going to use that term a lot tonight, but AFCCA it stands for Aggression Toward Family or Family and Caregivers in Childhood and Adolescence. I also am a graduate of the FAR program, so quite happy to also speak to any experiences as a former grad of that program. It was wonderful. Maude, did you want to introduce yourself before I go forward?
Yes, why not? I'm also a graduate of the course. I didn't know you took it as well.
I did.
Yes, I'm Maude Champagne. I'm a psychotherapist and social worker, and I'm doing my PhD in AFCCA in the context of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and trauma. And I became quite passionate about this topic, and I hope this is helpful for everybody. And so happy to do this with Tracy.
Thanks, Maude. So we do have, I think, lots of time for questions, but I mean, this is also a fairly small group. So I would say, please feel free to ask questions as we go through as well. Having said that, I realize I'm sharing the slides, so I can't see the chat, but I'm assuming Maude or Ray or someone can jump in and flag us if we need to. Some of these slides, I will say, have a lot of text on them. And so I'm definitely not going to just read them. That's terrible for everyone. But we did leave where there is heavier text on the slides. It's generally because it's either tied to a particular set of language or definition. So it's there as background if anyone wants to go back and look at those after. And in this particular one, this is a full definition of AFCCA. And so before I dive into what it actually says, language was something that the consortium spent a great deal of time on in the first 6 months of working together. This issue, what we're calling AFCCA, is not new. Many families are experiencing this. This has been widely researched outside of Canada, going back 20 plus years, under different names, different acronyms. You may have heard of this under CPVA, APVA. I could probably run through a whole other list of alphabet soup of acronyms. But Adopt for Life, who Maude and I are both associated with, started hearing from parents and caregivers that we support, probably going back about 5 years ago now, that they were having this, they were experiencing this, excuse me, in their families, that they needed a way to talk about it, that they didn't know how to put up their hands and ask for help without experiencing a lot of shame and blame and stigma. And as we started to bring forward conversations, we faced a lot of that same resistance of people saying, you can't talk about this, it's too stigmatizing. And so the more work we did, the more we realized how important a common set of language was that gave us a way to have this conversation. And so a lot of the work that the consortium did initially was really geared around coming to a definition and a set of terminology. And so what you see on the screen is the definition. The consortium describes AFCCA as a pattern of behavior that exists in childhood and adolescence, characterized by aggressive behavior by a child or adolescent towards family members or other caregivers. It causes significant harm, both physical and psychological, to the adolescent or the child themselves, the person that the behavior is directed towards, and other witnessing family members. It is most often directed towards parents or primary caregivers, and often siblings in the home, but it can also be directed towards caregivers in other settings. You're going to see as we go through a lot of who we heard from and who we talked to as we were doing this research and as we were doing this work. And certainly we heard from youth who are in non-traditional family settings, who may be in out-of-home residential or placement settings. And so we've frequently heard that caregivers in those settings are also experiencing this. And concerning, the behavior often becomes entrenched and escalates over time. This definition is now embedded in an operational definition. We'll share some links near the end of the presentation where you can go and read those full documents or download the consortium's full report as well. So the National Consortium on AFCCA came together about 2 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been 2 years already, with voices and representation from across the country. So Adopt for Life and Kids Brain Health Network partnered together and brought together the organizations that you see on your screen for conversations to focus on, again, language, definition, and to better understand what was happening with families so that we could collectively look at how do we improve outcomes. Collectively, they represent the voices of families, that's parents, caregivers, youth, and adolescents themselves, researchers and academics, practitioners, so social services, psychotherapists, counselors who were working with families, social systems, in particular youth justice and child welfare, and then public policy holders or developers or public policy influencers to understand how do we better support families at a systems level. Most importantly, though, and I think something we're really proud of, is there was a strong desire from the very beginning to center on the voices of families as the true experts of what was happening in their families. And so in the first year of the consortium, we had the opportunity to bring forward and speak with more than 100 parents, caregivers, young adults, first voice advocates with lived experience. And all of the work of the consortium, when you see not only the findings we're going to share tonight, but if you go and download the reports or the website, is really centered on what they told us and their insights. Before we dive into data, I wanted to share an analogy, and I'll give Maude full credit for this. As we spent so many months in the beginning talking about how do we talk about this topic, it was Maude that put forward this idea of thinking about it as a tornado, thinking about AFCCA as a tornado, and a tornado that existed within the family. And as we really thought about that, there's some strong parallels when you think about how a tornado gets started. It's just wind, it just happens, it's natural, it's part of our environment. And it starts as something much stronger, much smaller and softer. You know, there's a breeze, you can start to feel it within the trees, you can start to see leaves moving, we start to feel a wind maybe building as the environment changes. But as it grows in intensity, things start to shift. And when the force or the pressure behind that tornado builds, we start to think about, how do we take safety? How do we keep ourselves safe? How do we keep our kids safe? But it's pretty rare that we do that on our own. When a tornado really hits, you see communities come together. You see people helping other people around them with supplies and safety plans and keeping each other okay. And the more we really thought about that, we saw the comparison to thinking about AFCCA as that tornado. And I want to really be clear, the child is not the tornado. The tornado is happening to the child, just like it's happening to parents or caregivers and the rest of the family. And so we strongly think you can think about AFCCA as a tornado, and how do we help families weather that storm with understanding and communities of support that help them understand what's happening and things that may help. So with that, I'm going to jump into some of the findings of the consortium. Again, this piece on language is so critically important. And so as we thought about definitions and terminology, there were really 3 criteria we looked at as looking at how do we approach defining and scoping and naming this, and seeking a name that really did 3 things. 1, it honored lived experience. So it heard all of those voices of parents and caregivers and youth, and really was describing what was actually happening to them, while at the same time realizing or working to not stigmatize or pathologize children. And you'll see in some of the data as well, how do we keep from criminalizing or potentially portraying children in ways that depicts them as perpetrators or as violent offenders? So how do we make sure we don't do that, and that we take an anti-stigma approach, while still being meaningful, though, to the professionals who are trying to support families in a way that helps them recognize what's happening. And as one of our consortium members said, you know, language dictates protocols sometimes. So how do we make sure that when a family says this is what's happening, I'm experiencing AFCCA, or AFCCA is happening in our home, that it means something to professionals to say, oh, I need to intervene differently here. And so that gets you to aggression towards family and caregivers in childhood and adolescence. Again, focused on describing what is happening, who it's directed towards, and when it's happening, as opposed to how do we characterize a child or a youth. I just want to share as we go through a couple of stories of individuals and again, family members who participated. All of these stories have been anonymized just to protect people's privacy. Jamie is a young adult who was diagnosed at age 14. She's currently a young woman who is an advocate for children and youth in the autistic community. She is a very vocal champion for first voice-led change within the child welfare system. And she herself experienced AFCCA. She lived with others who experienced AFCCA, and she has experienced AFCCA as a sibling as well. And it was Jamie was one of the first to talk to us about this idea of viewing AFCCA as a communications issue. You know, she spoke herself of struggling in not being able to find the words, or not being able to get out the words for what she was experiencing. And so that coming out as actions or behavior instead that was either directed towards herself or to others in her home. And you see that quote from her in the middle of, sometimes when we see violence, it's actually a communications breakdown. And that led to so many discussions with the young adults who were part of the consultations with us about how do we shift that thinking to seeing those communications needs versus the behavior as an output. And I want to in particular pay attention to Jamie's quote in the bottom right here, and I will say she felt very strongly about this point when we were talking about language. Disabled children, these are her words, disabled children, disabled people in general are at a pretty vulnerable point in society. The instant I'm labeled violent, dangerous, or aggressive, my place in society is so that I've fought so hard to get is out the door. And so we've really taken that and the trust that's been placed in us to think about that and how we represent it. So collectively, what did we hear from young adults? Really boils down to four things or four themes. They want to be seen, heard, and respected in this conversation. From an Adopt for Life lens, I think we approach this from a parent and caregiver perspective. But what we learned from those youth is very clearly they want to be part of the conversation and they have a tremendous amount to add. I mentioned behavior is a form of communication. So continuing to reiterate that. As we talk to them about interventions and multidisciplinary supports and circles of care and all of those things that we thought were so brilliant, they continue to remind us that it's also about a very deep need for genuine connection and community and feeling like there were people in their life who cared and were invested in them. So not losing sight of that, that very real relationship aspect. And lastly, that AFCCA may be more of a normal pattern of behavior than we might have expected. And I want to be careful with the term normal there. We're not in any way trying to say that what's happening for family members where they're experiencing, many cases, extreme unsafety, we're not saying that's normal or okay. We're saying that the incidence of this is far more common than what we might have thought. And that the more we learn about it, the more we realize that there are so many families experiencing this who have not been able to talk about it. Parents and caregivers, there's some differences obviously to what they said, and it really started with there's immense shame, blame, and stigma. So many times when parents put forward their hands and say, this is happening and I need help, they're met with either blame of you must be doing something about this, or they're told it's bad parenting. Neither of those things are true, but that's what parents continually experience. I mentioned again, we started this conversation from an Adopt for Life lens, thinking this was an adoptive issue. And what we've learned through Maude's research, other researchers, and what we heard from the consortium participants as well, this is happening just as much in biological families, families of origin, families of all kinds are experiencing this. I'm going to show you some stats in a minute, but families are living with an unexpectedly high level and frequency of dangerous behavior in their home. It's far more intense and far more frequent than what we understood. And when families are truly in crisis and they're putting their hand forward and asking for help, they're frequently in a position then of having to fight to remain together. When we start to see interventions from child welfare systems and from youth justice systems, there is often a risk to family placement, family stability, when families are saying, and parents and caregivers are saying, they desperately want to remain at the center of their child's care. And there are just so many roadblocks getting in their way. So quick look at some of the data. And I will say all of this data is on the consortium's website and is public. So you see the link in the bottom right, and is available in both French and English if you want to explore that further. But we asked through a series of focus groups, one-on-one interviews, panel discussions, case study interviews, some parent support groups, some written submissions, a whole host of ways we talked to families. And what boiled out of that were a couple of key themes. If you start on the left, again, one I mentioned, we asked them how often this is happening. 76% of them told us they were experiencing AFCCA in their homes daily or weekly. 55% of those considered it to be a severity of 8 out of 10 or higher. There's a wide range of what this looks like in terms of behaviors. It's angry and aggressive outbursts, it's destroying property, it's aggressive body language or posturing from a threatening standpoint. It's threats of harm, and harm can be physical, it can be psychological. What's important to remember here is that language at the beginning about a sustained pattern of behavior. These are not one-off incidents. It's a pattern of these things that we see over time. And again, most often directed towards parents, caregivers, siblings. And the one piece I would call out in the data on the right, the 72%, self-harm towards the youth themselves, when it's accompanied by other examples of this behavior, fits under the category of AFCCA. Our clinical team and our practice team was very careful to say, when we see youth who are self-harming and that's the only characteristic, we're not talking about AFCCA, but it is very common to see self-harm alongside of one or more of these other behaviors that we see here. In terms of onset and development and progression, again, I think one of the things we thought we knew coming into this was it was much more common in teens and adolescents. What we actually learned is that it frequently is being observed in younger children and then peaking or intensifying in adolescence. And what's notable is, in fact, parents and caregivers in hindsight told us that when they looked back, that there had been predictive behaviors in children as young as 2 years old that later became things that they would recognize as AFCCA. So I think there's a lot more for us to do to understand here, but you see a breakdown. The other piece I will just touch on is the 19 plus over here. That doesn't mean we think this stops at 18 or 19. The AFCCA Consortium specifically is looking at behavior in childhood and adolescence. And Maude can certainly speak to this more than I can, but we know this continues into to adulthood for many. It simply wasn't the focus of this work, but there are some parallel studies underway and some anecdotal data from family support groups where we see this continuing into young adulthood. Very frequently, families told us there were coexisting neurodevelopmental disabilities or related conditions. I do want to caution this slide is not meant in any way to talk from a diagnosis or from a diagnostic lens. And it is not meant to say that there's a link from a causation standpoint, simply that you can't ignore how often we heard from families that there were other neurodevelopmental considerations, that there were other factors that they saw linked to their child's or youth's behavior. And that's where, again, I not to put Maude on the spot, but a lot of Maude's research in this area specifically is the linkage between FASD and what we're seeing with AFCCA. But we also frequently, we're hearing from families with children on the autism spectrum, and anxiety, generalized anxiety disorders showed up actually ahead of both FASD and autism in the sample size that we spoke to. Just another story as we pivot to talking about some of the things we heard. As difficult as some of the stories we heard, there was also so much hope. And that's hard to convey maybe sometimes, but families who had successfully been able to navigate, who had been successfully able to advocate for care, who were developing family-led plans of care, and were willing to share with us, here's what's working for us. And some of those stories are really incredible. This Sam and Michelle, an adoptive parent to a 9-year-old daughter with a very difficult early history and some coexisting developmental delays. And as much as they talked as well about, getting lost in systems that were not prepared to help them, that didn't understand what they were experiencing, they also talked about creating solutions that work for them and their family and their daughter. In their case, that has meant creating a co-parenting or a shared parenting model where their daughter accesses specialized residential placement services, but where family preservation or keeping their family connected is at the center of what they've created. And you see that quote from Sam at the bottom, When we first adopted, we committed to helping her be the happiest, healthiest, safest Michelle that she can and wants to be. We've done that. It's just that she lives in a different part of the province from us. And I don't want to downplay the significance of that when I say it's just that she lives there. But this is what their family looks like. It's a non-traditional family, but they're still very much committed to their child. They're still very much attached as a family. And that focus on preserving their family is successful for them. So there are so many stories that we heard of families who are creating non-traditional arrangements with that fight to stay together and remain closely at the center of their child's care. There's a lot of words on this slide. I'm not going to go through all of them. The important part I would want to leave you with is when we started this, we were trying to understand impact to the child, or thinking that impact started with parents or caregivers. What we've come to understand is that we actually need to center our view of impact on the child or the adolescent at the center, and then consider how that ripples out to their parents or caregivers, to their siblings, and then more broadly to their community and society in general. It looks different for children and youth compared to their parents and caregivers, but there are some common threads between those two, and understanding what that looks like is helping us shape what interventions are most appropriate. One more story, and again, it speaks to the piece about hope. You know, in this case, again, this is an adoptive parent or caregiver. Their child joined their family at 13 months. When in hindsight, they thought they had seen things that maybe should have been predictive to them if they had known differently. And she talks about having gone through these crisis episodes and having to try to find help. But what I thought was really interesting is she talks about having to fight and spend time talking about and advocating for support and focusing on all the negative things about what was happening in her family, how that changed her as a parent. And her view of needing to shift what success meant and needing to shift how she thought about successful outcomes. And so saying, I started going into meetings with a whole other opening. My daughter's an incredible gymnast. She's hilarious. And this is where we're struggling and where we need help. And that opened up a conversation for us about how do we think about desired outcomes? What does success look like? You come back to that idea of weathering the storm and that analogy. And a parent in BC said to us, so if I'm thinking about weathering the storm, can you teach me to walk in the storm instead of working so hard to avoid it? And so we asked families what success looks like. And you see that data on the right here. Two things I would note, again, all of this data is public on the consortium website. We thought 100% of them would say we want the violence and aggression to stop. And certainly that does show up. It's up here on the right, 88% of reduced incidences of aggression or violence. But they also told us so many other things: improve self-regulation for their child, help us improve parent and child relationships, help me help my children improve their relationships between siblings. How do we focus on enhanced safety for other children in the home? Mention the risk of family instability or placement breakdown. 66% of them said to us they want that family preservation was their focus. How do we reduce the risk of instability or placement breakdown? So this data is helping shape helping our teams and helping our consortium partners think about how do we really change how we view successful outcomes for families. And with that, I'm going to transition over to Maude. I've talked a lot here so far, so I'm going to be quiet and hand over to Maude. And Maude, just let me know when you want the slides to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you, Tracy. How this all started for me, I had my tax grant with KBHN, Kids Brain Health Network, and we interviewed families who had kids with FASD during the pandemic. And we realized that families were reporting a very high level of aggression in their homes. And this is not something that they were talking about much before. And this is something I was also seeing in the autism community. So with KBHN, their idea is that, okay, if we see a need, we need to find solutions. So with Tracy was working with Adopt for Life. I was with KBHN. We made the partnership, and that's how the consortium you just heard about was created. And Tracy is, I don't know if you said it, but you're the director of this consortium, and now we're working on making this sustainable all over the country, and we're really happy with where we've gone so far, and just like 2 years.
I know.
And from that right. So, and from that consortium, from what we were hearing from families, we and when I say family, I'm including both, the young people who have been, using aggression, their parents and their siblings. We thought, okay, what do we do now? So we do have a set of policy recommendations to improve the system. Like, one thing that keeps coming up is parents having to relinquish their parental rights to get the proper support. And we see that over and over. And for people who are in the medically complex world, I'm sure this is something you're hearing as well. Like, foster families are paid to care for the kids, but not the parents. So they have to fight to remain together, like Tracy said. So part of our work is to build awareness in the community, in the medical field, in social services, so people are able to recognize it and know how to respond in a non-stigmatized way, in a supportive way. And I would say that as a therapist, to be honest, like, if someone was telling me, my child's often dysregulated, I always give the example. I'm picturing a child jumping on a couch. I'm not picturing like a parent with bruises, thinking, I don't know if I can keep my child. Sometimes we see the extreme where it's like the parent is scared for their life. There's serious injury, a lot of trauma. So that's why we need to work on having the proper language to not stigmatize further, but at least like get the social services or the medical professionals to go, oh, okay, like here, it needs an intervention. So we were also thinking, okay, what kind of intervention do we need? So for autism, for example, there's ABA, but what about a family intervention? What about the caregivers who have been traumatized, or the siblings? And what about family preservation? So we start looking at interventions that are using other places in the world. So we found, and I guess you can switch to the next slide. We found an intervention called Nonviolent Resistance. That, oh, okay, you can keep it here, and then I'll talk more about NVR. We talked about NVR. I'm going to talk about NVR, something I found in Europe. But first, there was 5 things that families describe as being, very important to be better. So peer support network. So this is something that we do in our new program. We have Facebook groups, we have support groups that are online. Respite program, something that, we keep on saying families need respite. It's not often available. As well, like learning and skills developmental program. I'll get into it after. And very often we need those programs or intervention to be trauma informed, because most members of the families will become traumatized. And we need other programs than justice. So some of these children will become like they will be charged by the police, and what they need is not necessarily probation. They need another type of intervention. So I'll talk about nonviolent resistance. I think it's on the next slide, Tracy. Okay. I keep thinking it's coming. Let's go directly to nonviolent resistance, because I'm also aware of the time. So nonviolent resistance, if you want to learn more about it, there's a reference at the top, Haim Omer. This is someone from Israel, and he's basing, like, the basis of his intervention model is on nonviolent resistance as a social intervention. So this is something that Gandhi was using, Martin Luther King. And to give you an idea, you know, for example, Rosa Parks, I don't know if you know the story in the States, she was not allowed to, she had to give up her seat in the bus for white people. And so a white person came to her, asked her, you know, you need to give me your seat. And as a black woman, she says, no, I'm keeping my seat. So she responded with resistance, but in a non-violent way. So it's the same idea, whereas parents are not victims, but they are resisting to some of these behaviors in a non-violent way. So sometimes what we see, like parents become so exhausted and traumatized that sometimes there's a joint escalation, either physical or verbal, or even in their non-verbal, they feel like threatened so much that it might escalate the crisis. So yeah, basically some of the tools from NVR were adapted to the family context. So we'll go to the next slide and then explain some of these elements. It's not all of them, but I'll summarize some of them. So one of the things is prioritizing. So we have an exercise called the basket exercise, whereas we will only focus on behaviors that are harmful or life-threatening, or someone might be injured. Like we're not going to bother about, you know, making like their own lunches, even sometimes hygiene, we won't be bothering about that for a while. Like just what is really, really urgent. And the parents are going to always resist those behaviors. And I'll explain what resistance may look like. So one of the things that is crucial to this approach is the community-based approach. So we will help the family in gathering supporters. What we found is that violence often thrives in secret. So we want other people around the family to be aware of what's happening in the home. And of course, there's different contexts. Like if we're dealing with someone who has like severe autism, this is not something that's going to work. But if we have other type of neurodiversity where there's some elements of control, this is something that could work. So we have supporters helping the parents de-escalate, call, text, offering respite. And some of the children or young people who use AFCCA, at times they also have very dangerous behaviors. Like they will, for example, like young women will meet much older men, go to their houses, engage in unprotected sex and things like that. And like they get very controlling. That's usually when the escalation might happen. So what we do is a campaign of concern, whereas, you know, the uncles, the cousins, like people who care about the family will share the concern with the young person, saying, you know, we care about you, we care about your parents, we know this is happening, how can I help? So this is making the behavior known to other people, and sometimes that's a deterrent to the child or young person to use aggression, and that works really well. And for some, it doesn't work at all, but at least the parent doesn't feel so alone, because there's that element of isolation in AFCCA that we see quite a bit. So gathering supporters is a big element of NVR. Also, active resistance is refusing services. So for example, like if they're really controlling about, this is what you're going to do, bring me food now, I want this. And this is something that sometimes happens with entrenched adults and autism. I don't have the link now, but this is like NVR was research in that context where parents were raising children with autism, maybe not too severe. So the children were failing to launch basically, and there was an over accommodation. So accommodation is good, but over accommodation is not good. So it's hard to find that balance. And then VR helps parents to sometimes refuse services when it's done in a not in an appropriate way. We really encourage self-care, and VR calls it self-care. We decided to call it restorative time because we're not talking about, going to the spa and bubble bath. We're talking about ways for the parents to be able to self-regulate, to recharge their batteries. And yes, that might be through having supporters, but we also use another approach called polyvagal theory that I will talk a little bit after. And it's a way for the parents who are traumatized by the child's behavior to go to a place of strength and resilience, I would say. So reconciliation gestures is another way to make sure we keep a really good connection with the child. It's doing things like, oh, I've done your favorite meal tonight, or just spending time with a child, because sometimes the relationship gets really tense. And there's also the neuro de-escalation aspect of it. Like for this week, I'm 3 days in neuro de-escalation training. It's a very different approach than what we have in Canada. This is something that was created in Netherlands. So in what context do we use NVR? I have done a pilot project with only 4 families who are raising young people with FASD, and it was really good. So Adopt for Life, which is a provincial organization in Ontario that supports adoptive families, kinship, customary care, and foster families, has received some funding to support adoptive families who are experiencing AFCA. So we're only 4 staff at the moment, 2 clinical staff, and we are using NVR. So thank you, Tracy, for going back. So we have support groups that are clinical using NVR, also peer support. We have regional parent liaison, so they are parents who have experienced AFCA and have adopted, and so they lead the groups. We also do a lot of advocating for these families, like meeting with Children's Aid, meeting with different professionals, so they are heard, they're supported. And we're also developing a lot of resources for the families that we support. So, and depending, I know that the research runs are across the country, so I won't get into too many details, but if you go on our Adopt for Life website, you'll see some of the things that we've done so far. Yes, and we can go to polyvagal.
Okay.
Okay, and then I think we can move to the questions. So polyvagal theory, I'm not going to get into it too much because this is the other clinician that uses it, and I'm not trained in it, so I don't want to say something that's not accurate. But basically, when I was talking about the parent being able to self-regulate, that's what we're talking about. So if the child starts to escalate and the parent gets in their fight and flight themselves, they might act out of fear or out of anger. And I'm not talking about, hitting the child, but just the body language can be scary for the child. So that's when we see a joint escalation. So we're training parents to go in a place of strength, so they're more able to de-escalate some situation. And we don't think that this is going to solve everything. Obviously, like when Tracy was saying, it's normal behavior for some kids. For some children, it's part of their symptoms and will keep on happening. So we have to find different ways to keep everyone safe in the family. So that's all I'm going to say about polyvagal. But if you want to know more, at the end, you saw it was Deb Dana Dana is like the expert in polyvagal. She's really good. It's very interesting. Again, the consortium that Tracy talked about, there's the full report on our website, the policy briefing, which we hope some of the policy aspect of it, we are able to advocate soon. All the definitions that we found, we're still very open to receiving feedbacks about some of these, terms that we're using, how we're talking about it, for different people, different situations. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add something else, Tracy.
No, I think that's what we had. We wanted to make sure we left time too for questions. We can also drop a link into the chat with the link to the Adopt for Life page that Maude was mentioning that has some additional resources as well. But I can stop sharing there. And Ray, I'm not sure if there's a particular process you want to follow for Q&A or just open discussion, but we'd welcome any questions anyone has, any feedback.